In the last lecture, we talked about what a clause is, and we looked at the basic structure of a simple clause. We've also talked about how different types of phrases can have different jobs or functions in a clause or a sentence. Well, clauses can have different jobs too, and the structure of a clause is a bit different depending on what kind of job it's doing as part of an act of communication. So far, all of the example sentences that we've been looking at have been doing the job of making a statement about something. If you think about it, you'll realize that we haven't looked at any example sentences so far which do the job of asking a question or giving a command. Clauses which do those kinds of job have a slightly different clause structure. But let's start by summarizing the most basic clause type. A clause that's used to make a statement is called a declarative clause. If you say the sentence, "I like coffee," then you're making a statement about something that you like. A declarative clause normally has the basic structure that we talked about in the last lecture, with a subject followed by a predicate. So for the clause, "I like coffee," I is the subject and like coffee is the predicate. Remember that in terms of the structure, the form of each function, the subject is a noun phrase and the predicate is a verb phrase. In this case, the verb phrase has the transitive verb like and it has the noun coffee as the object. I could make other kinds of statements about myself, still with I as the subject, but with different types of verb phrases as the predicate. So I could say, "I am fabulous," in which case the predicate has the copular verb am as the main verb and an adjective fabulous as the complement. Remember that am is a form of the verb be, and when be is the main verb, we call it a copula. I could also say, "I am talking to you," in which case the predicate is am talking to you, with an intransitive verb, talking, as the main verb, which is preceded by the auxiliary am and followed by a prepositional phrase, to you. The declarative clause is the basic clause type in English, and other clause types are derived from this type by changing the structure in various ways. We're now going to look at the other types, and you'll be able to see that the different types are named for their function, and they can be identified based on how their structure is different. Imperative clauses are used to give commands. We've said that a basic clause always has to have a subject, what or who the clause is about, and a predicate, what you're saying about the subject. Well, imperative clauses are the exception to this rule, because an imperative clause consists of only the predicate. It's only the verb phrase. So let's look at a few commands like "eat your greens," "be fabulous," "talk to me." Now you can see that each of these commands consists only of a verb phrase. But why is it that we don't actually need to have a subject-noun phrase in an imperative clause? Well, when you give a command, then that command is always directed to the person or the people that you're talking to, so you don't actually have to say the subject, you, because it's obvious. In fact, if you do include the subject-noun phrase when you're giving an order to someone, meaning that you're actually using a declarative clause structure, in English that makes the command sound more rude or firmer. If I say, "You be quiet," instead of "be quiet, please," then the person I'm talking to will know that they'd better obey. Note carefully that the structure of the verb phrase in an imperative clause has exactly the same options as for a declarative clause. You can have a transitive verb like eat, and it's still post-modified by an object-noun phrase, just like in the declarative clause. If you have a copula like be, it's still followed by a complement, such as an adjective phrase, fabulous. And if you have an intransitive verb like talk, it doesn't have an object or a complement, but it could be post-modified by a prepositional phrase like to me. So it's important to realise that the clause structure is different. Declarative clauses look different from imperative clauses, but the options for the structure of the verb phrase are exactly the same. Now that you know about the structure of phrases, you can build on this to produce different types of clauses. In fact, English speakers often use interrogative clauses, clauses with a question structure, to make commands. Instead of pass the salt, we say, could you pass me the salt? This is done for the sake of politeness, because coming straight out and using an imperative, pass the salt, is often perceived as rude. It's important in this case to be able to distinguish between the structure of the clause and the function that it's being used for. Pass the salt is an imperative clause, and it's being used to give a command. Could you pass me the salt is an interrogative clause, not an imperative clause, because it has the structure of a question, even though it may be intended as a command. So let's move on to look at the structure of interrogative clauses now. Interrogative clauses are used to ask questions. In the simplest case, they're formed by rearranging the structure of the declarative clause. For example, the declarative sentence, he is eating lunch, becomes the interrogative, is he eating lunch? The declarative sentence, you have finished your work, becomes the interrogative, have you finished your work? What has happened here to make the interrogative sentence? We said that the declarative clause has been rearranged, but what is the pattern to this rearrangement? Well, the first auxiliary in the verb group is moved to the front of the sentence before the subject noun phrase. So in he is eating lunch, the verb group is eating, and is the first auxiliary. From this, we get the interrogative, is he eating lunch? Where the auxiliary has been moved to the position in front of the subject. You can see that otherwise, the structure is exactly the same. In you have finished your work, the verb group is have finished, and have is the first auxiliary. From this we get the interrogative, have you finished your work? Where again, the auxiliary has been moved to the position in front of the subject. The exact structure of an interrogative clause depends on what type of question is being asked. We'll look at yes-no questions first, because they're more straightforward. Yes-no questions are questions that can be answered with either yes or no. So for a question like, is he eating lunch? We expect the answer to be either yes or no, and not, for example, purple. In this yes-no question, we can see that the first auxiliary has been moved in front of the subject. The same thing happened with the other example that we looked at, have you finished your work? Where again the auxiliary have has come to stand in front of the subject. A yes-no question always has to have an auxiliary verb in front of the subject. But which auxiliary that's going to be depends on what exactly is in the verb group for the equivalent declarative clause. If there's just one auxiliary in the verb group in the declarative clause, as in he is eating lunch or you have finished your work, then that one auxiliary is the one that gets moved to the front. Like in these examples where you have the primary auxiliary is in front of the subject in the first one and the primary auxiliary have in front of the subject in the second one. But if there are two primary auxiliaries in the verb group, it'll always be the first auxiliary that gets moved to the front. So in you have been waiting for a long time, there are two auxiliaries, have and been. It's always the first auxiliary that moves and the second one stays where it is. So we get have you been waiting for a long time, where the first auxiliary have is moved in front of the subject you. We can't move the second auxiliary been, because the sentence that comes out of that, been you have waiting for a long time, is ungrammatical. It doesn't sound right at all. if there is a modal auxiliary in the verb group, then because modal auxiliaries always come first in the verb group, it's the modal that moves to the front. So from you will be helping me, where there's a modal auxiliary will and a primary auxiliary be, the one that moves is the modal auxiliary will, and we get will you be helping me. We can't move the auxiliary be because be you will helping me is not a grammatical sentence either. So it's always the first auxiliary that moves, no matter which auxiliary that is or how many auxiliaries there are altogether. But hang on a minute. What about if there is no auxiliary in the declarative clause? If there's only a main verb? Well, a main verb can't be moved to the front of the clause to make a question. If the declarative sentence is he went, we can't move the main verb. We can't make the question, went he? So if there isn't an auxiliary in the verb group, then we have to add one in order to form a question, an interrogative clause. And the auxiliary that we use in this case is do. So the interrogative equivalent of the declarative clause he went is did he go? Now notice what happens to the verbs here. The main verb went is in the past tense. So when we add the auxiliary do, that has to be in the past tense in order for the meaning to be the same. And this is why we use the form did. But once we've done that, the main verb can't stay in the past tense too. We can't say, did he went? Instead, we have to use go, the base form of the main verb. And this is because we can only have tense in one place in the clause, and it always has to be on the first verb. We'll get back to this when we talk more about tense later in the course. There's one exception to the rule that a main verb can't be moved to the front of the clause to form a question, and this is the verb be. Remember that be can be used either as an auxiliary or as a main verb. When it's used as a main verb, that's when we called it a copular verb, we don't add do to form a question, we just move be to the front. So to make a question from he is a teacher, we take is and move it to the front. Even though it's the main verb because there's no other verb in the verb group here, we get is he a teacher. We don't add do in this case. We don't say does he be a teacher. Another example, he was happy, where the copular verb is was. Again, to make a question, we move the copula to the front and say was he happy. We don't introduce be and say did he be happy. The second type of question is called WH questions. WH questions are interrogative clauses which are formed with a question word. I'm sure you can remember being taught about WH words. The WH words are the question words, who, what, where, when, why, and the only one that doesn't actually start with WH, how. WH questions are also called content questions because they require more than just a yes or no answer. If the question is, where are you going? Then it's nonsense to just answer no. The same basic rules apply to forming WH questions as to yes-no questions, except that we have to add in the WH word. So the WH word goes first. Then there still has to be an auxiliary in the position before the subject, just like in the yes-no questions. If there is an auxiliary in the corresponding declarative clause, then that is moved to the front. So from you are going there, we move the auxiliary are to get where are you going. From he has done it, with the auxiliary has, we move the auxiliary in front of the subject to get what has he done. The bit of the clause that's being questioned can be any part of the clause. In you are going there, where are you going? The question was about an adverb. In the second example, he has done it, what has he done? The question was about the object noun phrase. And no matter what it is that's being questioned, the question word comes first. So in Where are you going? The question word where, which corresponds back to the adverb there in the declarative clause, comes first. And in what has he done, the question word what, which corresponds to the object noun phrase it in the declarative clause, also comes first. If there is no auxiliary in the verb group of the declarative clause, then just like with a yes-no question, we have to add the right form of the auxiliary verb do in front of the subject. So from you went there, we get where did you go with the auxiliary do inserted. We can't just move the main verb in front of the subject and say, where went you? And this is the case even if the main verb is actually do. We still have to put another do in. So to make a question from he does it, we put do in as an auxiliary to get what does he do. We can't just say what does he. The last type of clause we're going to look at is negative clauses. Negative clauses in English are formed with the negator not. And negative clauses are like interrogative clauses in that they need an auxiliary to go in front of the negator. So not goes in the verb group after the first auxiliary. Now that's straightforward if we form a negative clause from a declarative clause which already has an auxiliary in the verb group. As in she will be coming, we put not in after the first auxiliary, she will not be coming. But again, main verbs can't be followed by a negator. So if I want to negate the clause I saw him, I can't say I saw not him. I can't put not in after the main verb. If I want to negate the clause he ran, I can't say he ran not. So just like with questions, if there isn't already an auxiliary in the verb group, we add the auxiliary do. From I saw him, we get I did not see him. From he ran, we get he did not run. And just like with questions, the exception to the rule that a main verb can't be followed by a negator is the verb be. When be is used as a main verb, it can be followed by the negator. So from he was happy, we get he was not happy. We don't put do in to get he did not be happy. In English spelling and pronunciation, the negator not is often contracted and written together with the auxiliary. She won't be coming instead of she will not be coming. He hasn't eaten instead of he has not eaten. He didn't run instead of he did not run. He wasn't happy instead of he was not happy. Now this is really just a different way of writing and pronouncing the sequence of auxiliary and negator. And if you come across a contracted form like this in a sentence that you have to analyze, just divide it up like we've done on this slide. So instead of hasn't, just write has not and proceed from there. Now that we know a little more about clause structure, we can summarize the properties of some of the most important clause elements. A subject-noun phrase normally comes before the verb in a declarative clause. In Kim gave the teacher a flower, the subject Kim comes in front of the verb gave. The subject comes after the first auxiliary in a yes-no question. Was Kim giving the teacher a flower? The subject controls subject-verb agreement. What this means is that if the subject is third person singular, so if the subject is something that could be replaced by he or she or it, then the verb has to be in the S form in the present tense. But if the subject is not third person singular, then the verb can't have the S form. We say that the verb agrees with the subject because what the subject is decides what the shape of the verb is going to be. So when the subject is they, the verb can't have the S form. We say they give the teacher a flower, not they gives. But when the subject is Kim, then the verb has to have the S form. We have to say Kim gives the teacher a flower. Most pronouns have a special subject form, which is only used when the pronoun is the subject of the clause, as in, she gave the teacher a flower. We can't use the object form of the pronoun here. Her gave the teacher a flower doesn't work. Next, we'll look at object noun phrases. The object of a transitive verb normally comes immediately after the main verb, as in Kim picked a flower, where a flower is the object noun phrase. There are some verbs that take two objects, a direct object that the verb action is done to, and an indirect object which normally receives something from the action, as in the teacher gave him a book, where a book is the direct object, it's the thing being given. Him is the indirect object, he's the one who ends up with a book after the action has taken place. The indirect object, but not the direct object, can be a prepositional phrase instead of a noun phrase. And in that case, it comes after the direct object instead of coming before it. Kim gave a flower, direct object, to the teacher, indirect object. Finally, a complement comes after a copular verb. The copular verb is usually be in English, but there are a few other copulars, such as look and seem. Now remember that a copula acts kind of like an equal sign. It doesn't say that the subject does something to the complement, it says that the complement is a property of the subject. So in Kim is a student, being a student is a property of Kim. A complement can be a noun phrase, or an adjective phrase, or a prepositional phrase. And this sets it apart from an object, because an object can only be a noun phrase. A complement noun phrase often agrees in number with the subject. So if the subject is singular, as in the child, the complement will usually be singular too. The child is an angel. But if the subject is plural, the complement is also plural. We say the children are angels, not the children are an angel. The important things to remember from this module are that different clause types have different roles in communication, and that the name of the clause type tells us the job that it has. Declarative, to declare or make statements, imperative, to give commands, and interrogative, to ask questions. It's the grammatical structure that shows us which type each clause is. We can also see that the declarative clause is the one with the basic structure, and there are patterns to the way that the other clause types are derived from declarative clauses. We've also seen that the difference between main verbs and auxiliaries becomes very important when we're looking at different clause types, because auxiliaries play a special role in forming interrogative clauses and negative clauses. So if you're still not sure about the difference between main verbs and auxiliaries, now would be a good time to go back and revise it.